Well, it sounds like Penny Wong discussed a whole range of issues with the Prime Minister, including labour mobility, development spending, the recovery from the COVID pandemic. So a pretty wide-ranging discussion. But unsurprisingly, there was a pretty strong focus from the media, and I suspect amongst Australian officials as well, on the China Security Pact that the Solomon Islands has signed with Beijing, which has caused so much unease across capitals, not just in Australia, but also in New Zealand, in the United States, and across many Pacific Island countries as well. Now, it sounds awfully like Senator Wong extracted an assurance from Manasseh Sogavare, the Prime Minister, which he has already provided to a number of people, both in private and in public, that there will be no Chinese military base in Solomon Islands under this deal. And furthermore, that Australia remains, as Senator Wong put it, the primary security partner of choice for Solomon Islands. So both of those assurances, as far as they go, will be welcome, but there is still a deep sense of disquiet and uncertainty in Australia about exactly where this security pact will land. They're happy to have these assurances put out there, but they're not necessarily convinced that Solomon Islands will keep to that promise, particularly over the long term, where there's simply enormous uncertainty about where events might take Solomon Islands, and a great deal of uncertainty about how Manasseh Sogavare might react if, for example, there were another round of riots in Solomon Islands. Would that see China bring in, for example, security forces to offer protection to crucial infrastructure and potentially to Mr. Sogavare himself? So there are an awful lot of unknowns here, a great deal of uncertainty, and while Penny Wong will be glad to have had that assurance from Manasseh Sogavare, I don't think Australian officials will be relaxing. I think they will continue to watch events in Solomon Islands very closely indeed, and with a great deal of anxiety.
Penny Wong also announced the delivery of 200,000 paediatric COVID vaccines to Solomon Islands. How badly needed are these vaccines? What's the COVID situation like there?
Look, the COVID situation in Solomon Islands is serious. It's not nearly as dire as it was not that long ago when it was really ripping through the community, but there are still serious numbers of cases in the community. Now, its situation is much better than it is, for example, in Papua New Guinea, where there's just enormous amounts of vaccine hesitancy and a real struggle to actually get the vaccines into arms. Solomon Islands is progressing better, particularly in Honiara, but there are still difficulties in simply getting the vaccines out to people who need them. The problems are less around the availability of vaccines and more around the logistical difficulties that are faced with transport and the like, as well as vaccine hesitancy, which is a problem in Solomon Islands, although, again, seemingly not as rampant as it is in places, particularly like Papua New Guinea. So I think Penny Wong's promise today is significant. Australia has already promised, I believe, some 500,000 or so vaccines. So an additional 200,000 is not insubstantial, but is not a game changer in that regard. But it does really reinforce Australia's position as the #1 provider of COVID-19 vaccines in Solomon Islands and reinforces Australia's position as the main development partner in the country, a position that Australia guards very, very closely indeed.
Stephen, Penny Wong also met with some prominent female journalists in Honiara, in stark contrast to the Chinese foreign minister's visit, where media were largely restricted.
Yeah, and this is a point that Penny Wong has herself been quite keen to make on her trips through the Pacific. This is the 5th Pacific Island country that she's visited. That's if you count New Zealand, and she's pretty much faced the media, I believe, every single time along the way. So there's a deliberate point that's being made here by Penny Wong. Not only is she saying I'm open to the media, but she's also saying that this reflects a fundamental commonality between Australia and Pacific Island countries, between fellow democracies where freedom of the press is important. Now, of course, the reality is that freedom of the press is actually quite endangered in parts of the Pacific. In countries like Vanuatu in particular, we see real challenges to that principle. Even in Solomon Islands, there are hints of trouble, although the situation there is much better. But Penny Wong is really making an argument about values here. She's saying that Australia, like the Pacific, is a country that values the freedom of the press, and her decision to continue to take questions and to field press conferences while she's in the Pacific is an attempt to not only live up to that promise, but also to make a broader strategic point about Australia's values and the way that that meshes with the Pacific. Again, drawing a direct contrast at least once with Wong, who, as we know, took almost no questions from journalists when he was in the Pacific during his marathon tour last month. So, yeah, the fact that she is taking questions and holding press conferences is significant. It should be applauded, but it's also a bit of political and strategic messaging. And her lunch today with not just journalists, but also women across civil society and business, again, was a little bit of messaging there, sending a signal that Australia values civil society and values female empowerment. This is a real attempt to burnish Australia's credentials. It's not without risk, of course, because civil society groups are very grimly looked upon by Manasseh Sogavare. He has an increasingly contentious and contested relationship with them. But Penny Wong is clearly keen to make that point that Australia stands up for civil society, and that probably reflects a realisation that Australia has a distinct soft power advantage, one that Penny Wong is keen to drive home.
Stephen Dziedzic, thank you.
Thanks for having me.